The idea that stormtroopers are incompetent has become so culturally ingrained that it's rarely questioned. Yet that perception collapses the moment you stop judging them as comedic obstacles and start evaluating them as what they actually were: elite shock troops operating inside a mythic narrative that privileges heroes over realism. Stormtroopers were never designed to be neighborhood police, border guards, or ceremonial soldiers meant to look impressive while doing little. They were rapid deployment infantry, trained and equipped to overwhelm resistance before it could metastasize, to board ships violently, to seize infrastructure, and to extinguish insurgent cells with speed and finality. When you judge them by the wrong standard, you inevitably reach the wrong conclusion. Stormtroopers were deployed where the Empire expected violence, not stability. They were sent into contested zones, onto hostile ships, into rebel hideouts and across planets already deemed non-compliant. Their purpose was not to coexist with civilian populations, but to break resistance decisively and then move on, leaving fear behind as a stabilizing force. That distinction matters because it means their effectiveness should be measured by outcomes, occupation success, suppression rates, and deterrence, not by whether a handful of galactic legends survive encounters designed for narrative continuity. Most Stormtrooper victories happen off-screen because Star Wars as a story follows exceptions, not norms. We do not watch Stormtroopers dismantle ordinary rebel cells, crush local militias, or pacify systems without named protagonists because those stories end quickly and quietly. Canon repeatedly implies that these victories are constant and routine, otherwise the Empire could not have maintained control across thousands of systems for decades. Empires do not rule on vibes or intimidation alone. They rule because enforcement works often enough to make resistance irrational for most people most of the time. Stormtroopers were the mechanism by which that enforcement was delivered. The bad aim meme is perhaps the clearest example of narrative illusion being mistaken for in-universe incompetence. Stormtroopers do not miss. The story requires that certain characters survive. In-universe, they are shown repeatedly hitting civilians, resistance fighters, pilots, and unnamed combatants with lethal efficiency. We simply do not linger on those moments because Star Wars is not interested in following the lives of people who die without altering destiny. Protagonist survival is not evidence of enemy failure. It is the structural requirement of serialized myth-making. Confusing plot armor with poor training is a category error, not an analysis. When Stormtroopers are allowed to operate against non-heroic opposition, their effectiveness is undeniable. The opening corridor assault aboard the Tantive High 4 is not clumsy or chaotic. It is textbook close-quarters domination. Scarifi shows Stormtroopers clearing positions, holding choke points, and suppressing entrenched resistance until overwhelmed by fleet-level catastrophe. Jeddah demonstrates rapid occupation and crowd control under insurgent conditions. Hoth shows them advancing methodically against fortified defenders once shield and air support are neutralized. These are not the actions of ineffective soldiers. They are the actions of troops trained to operate under fire with coordination and purpose. Their armor and uniformity were never just about protection. They were psychological weapons. Identical helmets erased individuality and replaced it with inevitability. You are not facing a person you could reason with or intimidate. You are facing a system embodied in white plastoid. The lack of visible emotion, synchronized movement, and standardized weaponry communicated a single message. Resistance would not be met with negotiation. It would be met with force. Psychological dominance is a core element of military effectiveness, and Stormtroopers were designed to project it constantly. Star Wars often undermines Stormtroopers, not because they are weak, but because the story needs visual obstacles that can be overcome without moral ambiguity. Stormtroopers fill that role, which means they are sometimes sacrificed to pacing, spectacle, or symbolism. That does not retroactively redefine their competence inside the world of the story. Mythic narratives compress reality, they do not model it. When audiences mistake that compression for in-universe failure, they misunderstand both the Empire and the genre itself. More importantly, Stormtroopers succeeded at what the Empire actually needed. The Empire did not require flawless battlefield records, it required compliance. Stormtroopers made defiance expensive. Rebellions were crushed before they could spread. Populations were intimidated into silence. Underground movements were forced to operate at extreme risk. That environment does not exist if the occupying force is laughably ineffective. The Empire ruled not because people loved it, but because resisting it usually ended badly. Stormtroopers were the reason that calculation existed. Even some of their most cited failures dissolve under scrutiny. The Death Star escape is not evidence of poor marksmanship. It is explicitly revealed to be an intentional maneuver designed to track the rebels back to their base. That alone should end the debate. Soldiers following orders to allow escape are not failing. They are executing a broader operational objective. Tactical restraint is not incompetence. It is control. The fact that stormtroopers could modulate their lethality based on command intent speaks to training, not deficiency. Stormtroopers were never trained to defeat heroes. They were trained to defeat populations. They were optimized for mass suppression, urban warfare, shipboarding, and rapid occupation. Expecting them to consistently kill Jedi, chosen ones, or narrative focal points is like judging modern infantry based on how they would perform against superheroes. Heroes exist to break rules. Armies exist to enforce them. Measuring one by the standards of the other guarantees misunderstanding. In reality, stormtroopers are frightening not because they always win on screen, but because they represent a system that works well enough to endure. They are not symbols of a collapsing empire. They are the reason the empire lasted as long as it did. The real horror is not that stormtroopers were incompetent. It is that they were competent enough to make resistance rare, costly, and desperate. The joke version of stormtroopers is comforting. The accurate version is not. What makes stormtroopers so persistently misunderstood is that audiences subconsciously judge them by the wrong narrative function, because Star Wars trains viewers to associate threat with individuality and failure with uniformity. Heroes have faces, names, emotions, and arcs. Stormtroopers are deliberately stripped of all four. That design choice does not signal incompetence, it signals dehumanization, and dehumanization is a core feature of effective authoritarian enforcement. When violence is faceless, it feels inevitable. When enforcement is interchangeable, resistance feels futile. Stormtroopers were not meant to be memorable as individuals. They were meant to be remembered as an experience, the moment when hope collapses into fear. This is why stormtroopers feel omnipresent even when they are not on screen constantly. Their power is statistical, not cinematic. For every firefight we watch where a protagonist escapes, there are dozens we never see where resistance cells are erased, informants are executed, and infrastructure is seized without spectacle. Star Wars does not dwell on those moments because they do not advance mythic arcs, but the world building collapses if they are not assumed to be the norm. An empire that fails most of the time does not need rebels, it collapses on its own. The very existence of an organized rebellion implies an environment where opposition is exceptional, dangerous, and usually fatal. Stormtroopers are the reason that environment exists. Another overlooked element of their effectiveness is logistical scale. Stormtroopers were not mercenaries or local militias. They were standardized, centrally supplied, rapidly deployable units backed by fleet power, intelligence networks, and planetary governors. Their effectiveness did not rely on winning every firefight, but on appearing everywhere at once. Speed of response matters more than kill ratios in counterinsurgency, and the Empire excelled at flooding zones with force before resistance could coordinate. Stormtroopers functioned as the visible tip of a much larger coercive apparatus, and judging them in isolation ignores the system they were designed to operate within. Uniformity also simplified command and control. Identical training, equipment, and doctrine meant that stormtrooper units could be redeployed across sectors with minimal adjustment. They did not need to integrate culturally or politically, because they were not there to govern. They were there to suppress. This made them brutally efficient in environments where local forces would hesitate, defect, or sympathize. Stormtroopers were reliable precisely because they were detached. Empires prize reliability above all else. It is also worth confronting an uncomfortable truth about why audiences like to believe stormtroopers are bad at their jobs. The joke is reassuring. If stormtroopers are incompetent, then the Empire feels less real, less threatening, and less reflective of how authoritarian power actually functions. Turning them into comic relief allows viewers to distance themselves from the reality that most oppressive systems persist not because their enforcers are foolish, but because they are frighteningly effective at discouraging resistance. The meme protects the audience from the implication that ordinary people, well-trained and well-equipped, can uphold monstrous systems simply by doing their jobs competently. Stormtroopers also expose how selective our moral framing can be. When a named hero defeats dozens of faceless soldiers, we cheer. When those same soldiers suppress unrest elsewhere, we laugh at their supposed ineptitude. But from an in-universe perspective, Stormtroopers are not villains because they are bad soldiers. They are villains because they are good ones serving a corrupt regime. Their effectiveness is precisely what makes the Empire horrifying. An ineffective tyranny is a farce. A competent one is a nightmare. This reframing also clarifies why Stormtroopers begin to lose effectiveness only when the Empire itself begins to fracture. As legitimacy erodes, intelligence leaks increase, coordination falters, and command becomes paranoid rather than strategic. Stormtroopers do not suddenly become worse at shooting. They are placed into unwinnable situations by a decaying hierarchy that no longer understands the difference between control and overreach. Their losses increase not because they have declined, but because the system they serve has lost coherence. Soldiers cannot compensate indefinitely for structural rot. In that sense, Stormtroopers mirror the Empire's trajectory perfectly. At its height, they are precise, overwhelming, and terrifying. As the regime destabilizes, they become stretched thin, redeployed constantly, and sacrificed to increasingly symbolic objectives. Their apparent decline tracks the Empire's collapse, not their own competence. Mistaking the symptom for the cause leads to the false conclusion that Stormtroopers were always ineffective, when in reality they were effective until the system they upheld could no longer sustain itself. Ultimately, Stormtroopers are not the punchline of Star Wars. They are the proof that the Empire worked. They are the reason resistance movements had to hide, fracture, and rely on miracles. They are the reason hope was rare and fragile. The mythic story follows the people who survive encounters with them, because myths follow exceptions. History, however, is written by systems, and Stormtroopers were one of the most successful systems the Empire ever built. The uncomfortable takeaway is not that Stormtroopers deserve more respect as characters, but that they deserve more seriousness as an idea. They represent how authoritarian power actually enforces itself, not through constant spectacle, but through routine, repetition, and overwhelming presence. Laughing at them makes the Empire feel fictional. Taking them seriously makes the Empire feel plausible. And plausibility is far more disturbing than fantasy.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.